So, I'm here with Sarah Waters. My name is Lenny Goodings, and I'm publisher at Virago. And Sarah, you've been with us since 1998 when you came to us with your first novel, Tipping the Velvet. It was immediately obvious what a great writer you are. And we've gone on, happily, to publish another 5 books: Affinity, Fingersmith, The Night Watch, The Little Stranger. And now we have the extraordinary Paying Guests. Can you just set the scene for us, please?
Yes. Well, The Paying Guests is set in 1922. Most of it takes place in a house in suburban South London in Camberwell. 1922 was a fascinating time in London's history, in British history. It was still very much at the tail end of the First World War. There was a lot of grief around still. There was a lot of disillusionment around. The main characters are Frances Ray, a young spinster and her widowed mother, and a sort of upper middle class family. Like lots of families of their class, they've lost money and they've been obliged to take in lodgers. The paying guests of the title, Leonard and Lillian Barber. They move in on the first page, and the novel is about the entangling of the two households and the rather dramatic consequences that has for them.
And it is amazing. And you are an amazing storyteller. It's a completely roller coaster ride, this book. And often that is the truth with a lot of your books. People often say that they have to hold their breath till they get to the end. The tension and the pace is just superb. That must give you huge pleasure.
It does. It gives me, as a writer, a devilish kind of pleasure, really. I feel awful. I feel like I'm betraying my characters to say this, but because poor Frances and Lillian in The Paying Guest, for example, they have really quite a tough time of it. I mean, I can't give too much away with this book, really, because very dramatic things happen. But basically, they start getting frightened halfway through the novel, and they remain frightened for the rest of the book. So I had to enter into their predicament, and it does get quite suspenseful in the second half, and suspense is a great narrative engine. It's a great thing to get your teeth into as a novelist. So there was a lot of, as I say, devilish relish to be had from this novel, but I also felt terribly for my characters and their dilemmas. So for me it was a very emotional book as well, actually, this one.
And you have the sort of ambition to give the reader pleasure.
I do. I'm definitely writing with a reader in mind, not a particular kind of reader, but technically I'm definitely constructing something for, I hope, the enjoyment and the enchantment, hopefully, of a reader. I want a reader to be able to enter my books like entering a world and going on a journey, really, that I've carefully constructed for them. I really want my reader to feel in safe hands when they start one of my novels. I hope they do.
I think one thing that people do love about your books are the characters. There's unbelievably realised. There's no sense of them being cliched or kind of just using props to sort of make them come alive. And the thing I also like about it is that you're not afraid to make them unlikable either, are you? They must feel real to you, though. But do they ever surprise you?
It's interesting. I usually start with quite a clear sense of plot when I'm writing a novel, and that tends not to change very much, throughout the whole writing process. Once I've settled on what I want the story to be, where I want it to go, how I want my characters to end up even, that tends to be rather fixed. But what changes immensely is how my characters feel about the plots I put them in, because I don't necessarily know that at the start. And really, I think bringing a character to life is getting to know them and getting to figure them out, getting to realise how they would or wouldn't behave in a certain situation and how they might feel about each other. So, for example, with The Paying Guests, it took me a long time to write this novel. It was about 4.5 years, which is about a good year longer, I think, than it should have taken, because I did have to do a lot of figuring out of Frances and Lillian and their relationship and their motivations, and I couldn't get the tone right. About 2 years I struggled to get the tone of the book right. And actually that was, I think, because partly I was resisting it being a love story, and it is essentially a love story. I'd worried that it was just a romance and that was rather too small or something. But when I realised, no, their relationship is at the heart of this novel and should be, then I felt much more behind them and could commit to it being a love story. And from then on, it was a much more straightforward writing process.
And what about them being unlikable?
Well, everybody's a bit unlikable, aren't they? We all do unlikable things. I think in order for your characters to feel lifelike and convincing, they need to have a few flaws. And this is the Paying Guests of all my novels, I think, is a very moral book, in the sense that my characters end up in a real moral predicament, and they have to make choices, and they don't always make the right ones. And it was important to me that they weren't saints, you know, that they were like all of us, sort of muddling through, sometimes doing the right thing, sometimes doing the wrong thing, sometimes doing the wrong thing for the right reason, you know, and they just have to find their way through this sort of fog of uncertainty and kind of get there in the end.
I've always liked the fact that you do this in a lot of your books, particularly in this book. You have these very ordinary lives. On the surface, they look ordinary, and then extraordinary things happen to them. And you've said that, you know, you love to see that into an ordinary life comes drama and passion. And I think that is both, you know, something we all live with in some ways, or maybe something we all want to have in our lives. But it strikes me as quite a sort of Hitchcockian trope as well.
Yes, well, I think, you know, I mean, if you look at say domestic crimes, you know, the people usually caught up in them tend to be just like us, very sort of ordinary people who make a bad decision and terrible consequences follow. I mean, I think there are lots of different ways of writing historical fiction, and one way is to concentrate on kind of well-known figures, you know, celebrated figures, high society figures. And another way, which is the way I preferred to work, is to think about the stories that haven't made it into the historical record because they're too ordinary or too humble or, you know, too secret, too hidden. So that's definitely been something that has charged all my novels, really. And with The Paying Guests, you know, I went to the 1920s not knowing much about it except for stereotypes from high society, flappers. You know, I started off reading Evelyn Waugh and people like that, and I just couldn't connect with it at all. And I realised I wanted to look at much more modest suburban lives, and that was the starting point for me, really, thinking, you know, what could these very ordinary lives, what sort of depths of passion and drama could they contain?
And another sort of veil that you lift, it seems to me, is that you tell us about lesbian lives in historical periods. And you write really wonderfully about that, and very frankly, too, about desire and sex. I'm thinking of Tipping the Velvet, obviously, but also Fingersmith and The Night Watch. So is that really important to you?
Yes, I mean, it's been there at the heart of most of the books, well, all of them really, apart from The Little Stranger, which was me exploring my gothic side. It's a haunted house story. But the other novels, as you say, they've all, you know, lesbian desire has been right there at the heart of the narrative. But at the same time, I think they've worked in different ways. So Tipping the Velvet, you know, is a romp and is much more a sort of fantasy history. It was a kind of me kind of claiming Victorian London and sort of filling it with lesbian possibility. Whereas the other novels, Affinity in particular, say it was kind of the underside of that. It was really thinking much more about what the reality of lesbian lives might have been in the 19th century. And of course, you know, they would have been a lot more hidden and underground. So it's kind of teasing those out. The Paying Guests, I guess, does something similar. I mean, when you move into the 20th century, you can be a lot more confident in talking about lesbian relationships, lesbian desire. We know that we've got lots of records of women who lived very open lesbian lives. People like Sylvia Townsend Warner, the writer, and her lover Valentine Ackland. You know, they lived very openly as a lesbian couple. So we have that information. But inevitably, too, for more sort of, for want of a better word, ordinary people, I think it's still a very secret history. And so part of the pleasure of The Paying Guest was imagining a kind of lesbian history sort of right there in that 20s London that we're all quite familiar with in more mainstream sorts of ways.
But you're not afraid to put desire and sex right on the page?
No, I think it's important. I want to write about lesbians in a way that feels authentic and feels honest. I mean, we often see lesbian sex presented in a rather pornographic kind of way or a titillating kind of way, and in a way that doesn't really feel like it's got any connection to real kind of lesbian lives at all. So it's important to me that my lesbian characters are fully desiring, sexual and romantic characters like we all are in life, you know, and I want to sort of do justice to that on the page if I can.
You write beautiful prose, and do you read it out loud yourself when you're working on it?
I do tend to. As I'm writing it, I'll often find myself reading it aloud, which is very useful for getting the kind of the cadences of sentences and things like that. I mean, I do a lot of rewriting too. That's the heart of writing for me, and I think probably for most novelists, just sort of going over and over and over and over and over a piece of writing on every level, on a sentence, on a paragraph, on a scene, on a chapter, ultimately on the whole book. Just going over and over it until you feel you've got it just right.
We think Juliet Stevenson has really caught your voice and writing perfectly. I think she's just wonderful. She could be Mrs. Ray in the movie, I was wondering.
That's a nice idea, isn't it? That's a nice idea, actually, yes. But she certainly has. She's done a brilliant job with the audiobook. I'm delighted, yes.
And do you have a favourite character in this novel?
Oh, I'm very fond of Frances, who's really the heroine of the novel. It's not a first-person narrative, but it's very much told, well, it's told entirely from Frances's perspective, and I felt very close to her. She's an interesting character. She's quite spiky and quite brittle. It was the last generation of daughters, I think, who, if they were unmarried, were expected to stay at home and look after their aged parents, sort of service the household. So she has had an interesting past, we discover, when we're further into the novel. And she's made a decision to stay with her mother and deal with the failing household and to deal with the family grief and the loss of money and stuff. So she's a very noble and brave character in lots of ways. But like Lillian, with whom she has, an affair, that the novel tests her later on. And it's a novel about bravery, really, about how we can be brave in difficult circumstances, I think.
That's very nicely put. And what about the other characters from the other novels? Do you have them still in your mind?
I do. Kay from The Night Watch was a favourite character of mine. She, again, is a very sort of noble character in a book in which everybody has failings in big and small ways in The Night Watch. And I think Kay is the only person I think is genuinely rather heroic. She's an ambulance driver during the war, but she sort of carries that rescuing quality into the rest of her life. And Caroline in The Little Stranger I was also very fond of. They're all kind of similar, actually, Kay, Caroline and Frances. I think they're related. Although Caroline is she's a lot more brittle and a bit more sort of unstable and not quite so admirable as Kay, but likeable, maybe in a different kind of way. Maybe she's a bit more human.
She doesn't know herself as well as maybe Kay and Frances.
Yes.
Readers talk about being totally immersed in your worlds, first in the Victorian novels, Tipping the Velvet, Affinity and Fingersmith, then the 1940s books, The Night Watch and The Little Stranger, and now the 1920s. How do you manage to pick up the feel of the periods? You get the language, the slang, the syntax exactly right. How do you get to that?
Well, that's, for me, one of the challenges, but also one of the excitements of writing historical novels. I really enjoy that, getting to know a period, first of all, and then bringing it to life on the page, hopefully, for a reader. And it's research, it's just lots and lots of research. I usually start the process of writing a novel with a period that's just research. When I'll be reading about a period, I'll be reading books from the period. Novels from a period, I find, are a great way into the sort of mentality of the era. And I'll just read until I begin to get a feel for the period and begin to see what its stories are, and then find a story of my own that somehow belongs to the period and tells us something about it, hopefully. And characters begin to emerge for me. And then I kind of, I begin to know enough to begin to tell their story, but I'll keep researching as I write. The research will become more targeted as I write because I'll know what I need to know by that point. If they've got a job or what they're wearing or what they're eating, I can be much more focused with my research. But I keep reading books from the period until the very last day of writing, really. And most of it never goes into the book. That's the thing. Most of it never gets in. But I like to know it. I like to know what's surrounding my characters, even if I don't describe it. I like to know what's there.
And what about the slang?
The slang. 20s was a really interesting time for this because it was hard. I found it quite hard to put my finger on the tone of the 20s, especially after having moved there from the 1940s, in which my last two books were set, which has a very strong, clear voice to it, I find. That sort of clipped British voice. It's a stereotype, but it's a stereotype for a good reason. It's very present in the novels and the films of the period. But the 20s was much more of a mishmash of voices, and I just couldn't find my voice at first, or its voice, rather, I suppose. But it was a time when middle-class and upper-middle-class people were using slang for the first time in a really relishy kind of way. So you can read the diaries of Virginia Woolf, for example, or the letters of Catherine Mansfield, and they like swearing a bit, and they like using the odd bit of Cockney slang. And it was obviously something to do with casting off those Edwardian mores. People were really enjoying that. So that found its way into The Paying Guest. Certainly Frances has a touch of that. She likes to swear a bit now and then.
And in The Paying Guests, we have the house, and around which the whole everything is set. And I know that houses are important to you, and that you've said Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House is a favourite of yours because of what she does with her house in that novel. And then in The Little Stranger, your last novel, the old house was almost a character. And I feel the same here. Is that how you see it too?
Yes, houses do seem to take on that kind of role in my novels. I guess because lots of the stories I tell are quite domestic. Often they're about women's lives, which historically have been quite domestic lives. But then again, it could be on a much bigger scale than that, with the country houses of Briar in Fingersmith and, Hundreds Hall in The Little Stranger. So I can't quite account for why buildings, cast that sort of spell over me. But certainly in The Paying Guests, this fairly modest middle-class suburban house is the locus of most of the drama in the novel. And of course, it's a novel in which two households are having to live together in shared space. The Rays, the owners of the house, and then Leonard and Lillian move in. And there's all the complications and the uncertainties and the odd excitements about that arrangement. So I realised quite quickly that it's the communal spaces in this book that become charged and important. The stairs. There's lots of people often looking up the stairs, wondering what's going on, or listening at walls because they're not quite sure what's going on in the next door room. And in the first half of the novel, when Frances and Lillian are falling in love, that has a real that acquires a real erotic charge to it as their lives are kind of beginning to entangle. But in the second part of the novel, after something very dramatic has happened in the house, it becomes much more fraught and much more dangerous. So the house is a bit of a pressure cooker, I think, in this book.
I love the line about the landing and being like Clapham Junction with people, sort of like trains hiding in the sidings.
Well, I've lived in a few shared houses over the years, and you do have to do an awful lot of negotiating. Those public spaces, the bathrooms and the landings, and it's first thing in the morning. You don't really want to talk to somebody, so you kind of wait until you you hear that they're safely back in their bedroom before you venture out. So I knew what I was talking about, really.
So at the heart of this, we've called it a love story and a crime story. What provoked the idea of the crime in this novel? And you're not allowed to spoil anything, please.
Yes, well, when I was starting to look at the 20s and trying to get a handle on the period and thinking about what sort of novel I wanted to tell, I began to look at true crimes from the period. There were a couple of murders that I knew about already. There was the Thompson and Bywater's case from 1922 involving Edith Thompson, a married woman having an affair with a younger man. He killed her husband, but both she and he, the killer, were charged and found guilty of murder. She was found guilty of incitement, and they were both hanged. And then later in the early 30s, the Rattenbury and Stoner case, it was a very, very similar case, a married woman whose younger male lover killed her husband, and she was put on trial, although this time she was found not guilty. And there's a wonderful series called the Notable British Trials series, which are books that contain transcripts of famous British trials, and they're just this amazing kind of electrifying read. And they incidentally give you lots and lots of fantastic detail about people's lives in the period in which the crime has taken place, about people's domestic lives, domestic setups, relationships. So I read several of those from the Edwardian period, the 20s and into the 30s. And they were just a fantastic resource for me. And what really fascinated me about them, I think, is that, when we read crime fiction, especially crime fiction from this very period, the golden age of crime fiction. So books by people like Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers, Marjorie Allingham. The crimes tend to be terribly neat. They're really well planned and tidy. And of course, if you read accounts of real murders, especially domestic ones, they're not like that at all. They're messy in every sense of the word, and they're accidental, they're random, and they plunge the people involved into these nightmare scenarios. And that really captured my imagination. And I saw an opportunity to take decent, likable characters and put them through the mill, I suppose, of a rather dreadful experience. And that was when it was born. Really, that's when The Paying Guest was born.
You know that Tolstoy quote about literature where he says, all great literature is one of two stories. A man goes on a journey or a stranger comes to town. And I think this is the perfect stranger comes to town novel, isn't it? Once Lillian and Len enter the house, everything's changed.
Yes, that's right. That's right. But of course, it only changes because it's all poised to change. Frances and her mother are living in that house in what seems on the surface to be a rather sedate and kind of tidy kind of way. But of course, what we realise as the novel proceeds is that they're both deeply unhappy figures. There's lots of tensions under the surface of their life, really. There's lots of things that Frances has put a bit of a lid on rather imperfectly. So here come Lenys and Lillian, who we also discover are rather unhappy. So, it's no surprise that the two households collide and that the novel erupts into sort of passion and drama, because it's all there just waiting to happen, as is often the case in life, I think.
So they're the catalysts, in other words.
Yes, exactly.
And also we have the period about to change too, don't we?
Yeah, no, this was something that really caught my attention when I was researching the early 20s in particular. I think it was just this time of enormous transition in British life. It was still very much in the shadow of the First World War. People were still in recovery. But they were figuring out how to move on, and there were, just in terms of technological changes, electricity was entering the home in a big way. The wireless was entering people's lives, motor cars on the streets, cinema. And in class terms, it was interesting too. The upper middle classes were suffering economically. They'd lost their servants, for example. They'd lost their live-in servants in particular since the war. So they were struggling. But for the lower middle classes, for people like Lenys and Lillian, sort of newly white-collar workers, life was opening up, actually. The working classes and the lower middle classes, families were smaller at this period because of the spread of knowledge about contraception. Working conditions were better. Wages had actually risen a bit for the lower middle classes. So it was this time when there were tensions around, what you were in recovery from and what you were looking forward to, and different expectations and different ambitions. And that's all good stuff for a novelist, definitely. So that's definitely there as a real charge in The Paying Guests.
So you have that very interesting thing where Frances, who is this upper middle class woman and rather looking down on this lower middle class, who's Len, who's patently the one on the way.
He's on the way up.
On the way up, and she's certainly on the way down. But
absolutely,
we as the reader understand that in a way.
Well, I think she realises that too. But what the middle classes were doing at this point was desperately clinging on to their prestige. And, if you're being threatened by a class rising up underneath you, how do you respond? What can you do? You respond by snobbery, really. You respond by sort of denigrating them and sort of being sniffy about their rather gaudy furnishings and the fact that everything's new in their house. Whereas, this was interesting for me because Frances is living in this house where she's inherited all this rather awful furniture from, elder generations that she's still having to care for, rather heavy stuff that needs sort of polishing and dusting every day. Whereas Lillian, who doesn't have that, in a sense is free to fashion herself however she likes and has filled her home with, knickknacks and it's really quite nice, and it brings something new to the house that Frances realises she doesn't have. So they have freedoms and limitations in different ways. Frances, there's this upper middle class spinster, so she has class status and she has a certain amount of independence. But Lillian's a wife, which kind of trumps a spinster in 1922, and she has this kind of mobility, this sort of social mobility that I think Frances doesn't quite have.
Mm. It's dynamic as a result of all these things. It's really exciting. I want to just take a second to look back over the 6 books, not individually, I don't mean, but first you have the fabulous sensation novels, and then the darker 20th century ones. What do you see? What do you see? What's next?
I'd like to do something a bit lighter-hearted next, because did love writing The Paying Guests, and I'm very fond of it now. But they go through a grim experience, and to follow them honestly through that took a lot out of me, actually. So I miss some of the verve of a novel like Fingersmith, which was huge fun to write. A novel which sort of is very much in the vein of those Victorian sensation novels like The Woman in White, with sort of complicated plots and twists and revelations and melodrama. It was huge fun to write Fingersmith. So I'd like to try and recapture some of that a bit with the next book. Not that I plan to return to the 19th century, but it would be nice if I could find that maybe in a 20th century setting. So maybe that's what I'll think about next.
I know you love Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, and I also read recently that you like Robert Louis Stevenson, which does not surprise me at all. What is it that you like about those two?
Yes. Well, there's a kind of writer I like who is, a thoroughly literary writer, but also a very popular writer. Not very, very happy at exactly that's the borderline between the literary and the popular. So I suppose what I mean is unafraid to use literary devices like suspense and twists and revelations. So Patricia Highsmith is another favourite writer of mine. Dickens actually is a great example of that. It's relished melodrama. So if I'd like my novels to be situated anywhere, it's exactly there. To have a kind of a sort of an intellectual weight to them a bit, I hope, and a kind of an emotional punch, but to be really good stories as well. I want to kind of entertain a reader and to just, take them on a journey.
You so do, Sarah. They're wonderful, and I'm thrilled with the paying guests. Thank you very much for sharing all that with us.
Thank you.